tonight I probably will really focus more on just what I do, how I do it, and in some cases why I do it. But the very first thing I would like to say, and I think maybe it's a certain degree of humility, if you came here looking for Michelangelo Buonarroti, you might be disappointed. But if you came here to find an artist and sculptor who really has tried to take advantage, tried to achieve as much as he could and push that goal as far as he could, I think I've tried to do that, and I think I've had a certain degree of success. I want to do kind of a three-part program today. I'd like to talk a little bit about who I am. I'd like to talk a little bit about the direction and the work that produced, and lastly, a little Q&A where you can ask me some questions, and hopefully I might have some answers for you. To begin with, I feel very strongly about this, and even when I was at Brookdale a long time ago, Dr. Callender and Mr. Blazer, we had a very early beginning over 40 years ago. Even then, I used to tell my students that several things are extremely important if you want to be an artist. Maintain your signature. Write your name down on a piece of paper, look at that, and focus on that personality. And that means you certainly can study with a mentor, you can work with a particular artist, but you have to be somewhat resolved to the point where you're not just becoming that artist. And I know a lot of fabulous artists that produce a lot of students that do exactly the same thing that they do. And I think in some cases that's a disservice to them. So I always focus on trying to maintain that signature. The last thing I like to emphasize is know thyself. And early on, I tried to focus as much as I could on finding out who I was. And so I probably spent a lot more time doing that than most people do. But I did want to do a thing called time, heredity, environment. I wanted to know who I was. And it's quite apparent I grew up in the 50s and 60s. It's quite apparent I grew up in an environment that was not like this. It was the Midwest. And this area is extremely unique. You've got fabulous art museums. We did not, where I grew up, in extreme western Iowa. We did have one good art museum, and that was in Omaha, Nebraska. And the Joslin Art Museum is one of the top 10 small museums in the United States. It has some of the finest regionalist artists in the United States, there in Chicago at the Art Institute. People like Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, these were people working in that environment and in that area, and that really did affect me. I wasn't affected as much by Jackson Pollock as de Kooning and all of these other people. I think their work is fabulous. I really do like all forms of art, not just realism. And by the way, if you want to know who Pollock's teacher was, anybody know who that was? It was Thomas Hart Benton. And of all things, and of course Benton, and how much teacher I'm not really sure, but anyway, Pollock studied with him, and Benton did these really neat kind of folksy regionalist painting, and of course we know what Jackson Pollock did. Another thing I like to focus on, so we have time, heredity, environment. I did focus a little bit on heredity. I knew something about where my family had come from, and an area that I really actually wanted to study. My paternal family was German from the Ruhr Valley. Know very little about them. I only remember my father's sister, my aunt, who was childless and actually took me to that Joslin Art Museum when I was very young. But they said they were starving, so they came to the United States. They were small businessmen. My maternal family came from Eastern France, and I really wanted to try to understand, maybe is this something that would have influenced me somehow physically, mentally, I don't know, whatever the case may be. But anyway, so I've got time. I knew where a little bit about where I came from, and then environment. I grew up in the United States, not Europe, not the West, but it was an environment that was a typical American boy growing up in the 50s and 60s, and that influenced me. After I did some of this research, which I'll talk about in a second, what I did was I kind of went through 4 stages that I think really influenced and really affected what I do. The first stage was going from, as I had mentioned earlier today, going from that teenager through college. I received a BFA degree. I then became a tax-paying citizen and a teacher. And that's a big transition, obviously, from when you were a high school kid whatsoever. But I did have that BFAE degree, which allowed me to teach. And I just assumed that's what I would always do. So I spent the first 5 years of that period after my degree teaching in a public high school. In fact, I ended up in Omaha, Nebraska, and at one point I actually taught at Central, which is right behind the Joslin. But that was a period of time that obviously I matured a bit, and I tried to work on the career that I enjoyed the most, which was sculpting, or at least not the career, but at least the subject and the medium. After that period of time, I had a wonderful daughter and a failed marriage. And what happened is, at that stage, I was 25 years old, 24, 25, and I had decided that I kind of had a clean canvas, a clean slate. And what I was going to do the next time was certainly going to be a little different than what I did the first time. And I really shifted my focus over to my second stage, which was continued education. And what I did is I was very fortunate. I think there's a certain degree of fortune that has happened to me all the way down the trail, but everybody has their journey and everybody has those things that happen. Well, in my case, I was able to acquire GTAs, graduate teaching assistantships. I ended up at the University of Denver, and I did an MA program. I had a rather successful MA exhibit, which was a requirement, of course. Write a paper, have an exhibit. I had a successful exhibit in terms of selling, and I took all the money I had, sold my car, all the above, and I bought a plane ticket, round trip. I bought a rail pass. I had spending money to live on, and I went to Europe with the objective, Western Europe. That's where I had influences. My objective was to go to every art museum, and it really was that objective. I took very careful notes. I literally traveled from, as I say, from Stockholm to Istanbul, and from Dublin all the way down through Spain. And I probably went to at least 3/4 of those great art museums. And boy, what a foundation can you have. I remember coming to New York the first time on the way to that trip and going to the Met and the Frick and the Morgan and all of those, and I thought, why am I going to Europe? And then when I went to Europe, I said, I'm glad I went to Europe. But the importance of that foundation was solidified. I went back to Denver after that trip, and I was fortunate again. I was offered another GTA at the University of Denver. So I always say that next stage of education, when I received an MFA and another thesis exhibit, which was fairly successful, and wrote my paper and all that stuff, I kind of realized that after a while, I should be something besides a professional student, which I like going to class. I like, you know, I got a little stipend for teaching, but then it was time for me to at least make some decisions, and I had met a guy in grad school who gave me a call and said, Tom, I'm teaching at a small college back east. Do you want a job? And I thought, a job, a salary, something other than, you know, that kind of studio, and it was pretty basic studio. I thought it'd be great. Number one, I could be on the East Coast, and number two, I'd have a salary. That guy was John Colantonio. John Colantonio was here at Brookdale. I came to Brookdale, and it was a great opportunity for me to be able to, again, kind of solidify the direction that I wanted to go in. I did not teach sculpture. I taught life drawing, and I taught art appreciation, which I love art history. I love reading about bios and trying to find out how other artists made a living so that maybe I could try to make a living. But it was very important. And that particular stage, that number three, and I always say this a bit with tongue in cheek, because the most important thing probably that occurred from there is I met Cynthia. I am her husband. She is not my wife. I am her husband, and I am only the sculptor in the family, but you might have recognized Cynthia back there in the back row with the yellow jacket on. Yes, indeed. I bow down in admiration to Cynthia, and as I say in tongue in cheek, it was actually a night class that she was taking. It was a night class, and it was legit. So anyway, the rest of it might not have been. But anyway, Cynthia and I married, and I always remember that one event. And I always tell people I remember the event. After 4 years, I was accepted as a tenured professor, and I received that first pension check. And now this is 1975. So it said in 2008, I would collect my first pension check. And I thought, oh my God, you know, it's like I'm cataloged into one spot. Not that I didn't like teaching. I really do enjoy teaching. I just enjoyed being in the studio more. And I tried to arrange my classes here, jammed them up into 3 days so that I could have 4 days in the studio. And after 3 days of 24 hours, it seemed like teaching. It was like, I need 4 days to come out of it. So I really decided that I'd like to try and make a living. I took a leave. Cynthia and I left New Jersey. I took a leave of absence. I did not quit. I took a leave of absence, unpaid leave of absence, went back to Denver, where I was certainly very familiar with in terms of the support groups. There was some great foundries, and one in particular that I could work with in casting my work in Colorado. But there was also some friend support groups, and I could regress a little bit. When I first went to Denver to study, I also met, for the first time, a professional sculptor. He actually was a sculptor, and he was a professional, which blew my mind. I'm thinking, my God, somebody can make a living doing this, what they love doing. I wonder if I could possibly do that. But anyway, we went back to Denver, and now the fourth stage, my professional career. I did 20 pieces of sculpture during that year. Very small, they weren't very large. And back then I worked a bit faster, more impressionistic perhaps. And at the end of that year, we had an exhibit. We were fortunate, we were very successful. We sold a lot of those pieces. And even then, I made a rather naive decision, but Cynthia and I decided that we were going to resign from teaching and actually open a studio. And I wouldn't say we haven't looked back since, but there were periods when I thought, gosh, I should have stayed in teaching. But if you're in the arts, it's not utilitarian. You're the first to know when there's a recession. You're the last to know when there's prosperity. And we rode that roller coaster for years. But what happened at that collection of 20 pieces? Because I was still trying to figure out, what am I doing? What am I going to be exhibiting? How am I going to work? What themes am I going to do? I decided that at the end, the last piece of sculpture in those 20 decades was a football player with a bird cage, which means it's that gladiatorial. In fact, the title of the piece was The Gladiator. I I took that and realized I knew something about sports. I wasn't a great athlete in any sense of the word, but I know what it was like to push myself, try to make a little bit better leaping ability and shooting ability, and I did play basketball in college a little bit. But what really solidified it was when I realized with that last piece, this is a theme that I can talk about. I did not know cowboys and Indians. I did not know avant-garde, although I appreciated it very much. And this fellow I was telling you about, a professional artist, Fritz White, he was a Western artist and a member of what's called the CA, Cowboy Association. And he made a living doing that, and I realized that's what I'm going to try. So I went off, and we decided that that's where I was going to focus my interest. What was probably the big change is I thought Cynthia was going to support me, and she tried very hard, but I kept bothering her. I kept saying, please write the letter, do this, can you make that phone call? I got to work in the studio. It eventually got so obnoxious that she quit her job and actually came to become my agent. And that's why I always say that I am Cynthia's husband, if I can possibly remember that, because having an agent is so extremely important. Having a good agent is a blessing, and I have both. And then I have a very lovely wife on top of that. So anyway, we moved on into that direction of work that represented athletics. And I would like to show you these pieces. I'll just kind of zip through them. If for some reason you would like to ask a question about a piece, I'd be more than happy to try to answer it, or we can just go through it. Probably easier to kind of hammer through the photos, and then I'd like to have some a little question and answer time where maybe you can I can maybe answer some questions for you. This piece of sculpture came from a collection that I titled the Olympic collection, but basically it was winning and losing. I did two pieces representing each sport that I chose. I chose football, baseball, basketball, all the major sports, and boxing. And I worked with a lot with the USOC Training Center there in Colorado Springs. I watched a lot of those young kids box, and it was the art influences life type of thing. It was life influences art. And if you look at this piece, even though it's even a little before the Olympic piece I'm going to show you next, I mean, it's obviously the influence I had on this piece for winning was Muhammad Ali when he knocked down Sonny Liston, and he's leaning over his body in glory and all this stuff and taunting, but that is the winning. And when you're boxing, pugilism is such a violent sport, and it's a solo sport. So at least this is, and I felt it really important to use things that influenced me to try to create these pieces. I don't have the other piece, but it was titled Mountain Rivera, from the Requiem of a Heavyweight by Rod Serling, I think. Pretty sure it was. Playhouse 90. Jack Palance starred in that. And of course the movie was done with Anthony Quinn and Jackie Gleason, Mickey Rooney. But he's the winner. So I had been following sports at that level. And the next thing that happened was about the same time I had finished that Olympic collection, those kids I was telling you about that helped influence some of this work. The US boxing team was flying into Warsaw, Poland. The plane crashed, the entire team was lost. All the boxers, all the coaches, Coach Robinson, for example, Coach Johnson was Sugar Ray Leonard's coach, and it was just a tragedy. In my mind, when things like that happen and I'm involved in it, and they had influenced me, I decided that I'm not going to just have somebody produce a plaque with their names on it. I wanted to make something that was more visual and more descriptive and more of a memorial. So I did a small version of what you see right here. The USOC gave me their blessings and said, we have no money, but whatever you want to do, you let us know. If you can get the money, we'll encourage you to do that. This piece happens to be at the U.S. Training Center, and obviously we got the money. This is the end results. It's this young fallen boxer on a tall plinth, and I kind of repeat that over and over again, and I guess I can tell you, being from Iowa, it's the Winnebago Sioux. They used to bury their dead on burial scaffolds, and I just liked that transition. Also, the pedestal for me is the frame of a painting. It disassociates the artwork from the environment. So that was the end results, but to get there was another story, because Cynthia called our collectors that we were working with at the time, and one of them happened to be a young actor. He had gone to Las Vegas. And even though we didn't have a lot of galleries at that time, we had one in Vegas. He bought a number of those pieces, including one of those fallen boxers, and that was this man. This is Sly Stallone. He said, no, I'm not interested in doing a support for that. However, why don't you come out to LA? We'll talk about doing something else. So Cynthia and I flew out to LA. I did have an idea. He told me he was interested in producing a piece of sculpture for one of his movies. And so we went to LA. I did a life mask, and I kind of knew that we were going in that direction. But I also knew that getting a guy like that to model for me was going to be very hard. So what I did is I took a life mask of Sly, and I took that back to Colorado. I produced a 28-inch model, which is a little difficult to see, but it's right here. This actually is me with the hair. And of course, I lined my studio with all kinds of images of him, and we created the Rocky statue. And I knew that it would help with the PR. I really didn't know it was going to be quite that iconic. This is working on placement. We have the 28-inch model. We're at the top of the museum, and we're moving this thing all over, and he's trying to come up with a decision on where it would go. And of course, there was a lot of controversy when the big one came in. I was modeling now on the monumental scale. It's actually 1.25 life size. And I'm using plastilina, which is an oil-based clay, because I can work in a very dry, low humidity environment as opposed with water-based clay. So we end up producing this. And there's a lot of history behind it, a lot of controversy behind it. But it at least did one very important thing for me, which was, as much as anything, people say, what had been done? And I can go to one piece that is somewhat iconic. I would like to say that the piece is the reason they go to the steps. I know that the piece is the reason they go to the steps and to Philadelphia is because of the story, which is Rocky I is a very good movie. It's the kind of thing that definitely helped my career. There's no doubt about it. But a lot of people don't know that actually there was some thought that went into it. At this stage in the films, Sly Stallone, or Rocky Balboa, was the victor. That's a classic piece of sculpture. He has very little expression on the face. It's a strong contrapposto pose, and that's it. Had he been like, Rocky VI, and there is going to be Rocky VII. So if I did that as the defeated boxer, like Mountain Rivera, it would have been Hellenistic. It would have had emotion. It would have had expression. This is classic, and that's what classic art was. It was beauty with superiority, the victor, blah, blah, blah. This photograph was taken, but that's what's happening, I guess, an awful lot at the sculpture. People are there almost all the time, any time of the year. Our friend Liz Ryan took that photograph, and you know, it's this kind of thing that keeps going that certainly kept my career alive. There wasn't any doubt about that. I think that as far as its impression on people, I simply was imitating life again, and it was a tremendous advantage for me to have done that piece of sculpture. These photos, this photo I know is difficult to see. It's actually a photograph outside of our studio in Evergreen, Colorado, and we're at 8,000 feet, so we're definitely in the foothills, in the mountains, in the forest, but they're small models. And I actually had a small model of that fallen boxer that you saw that went to the USOC. It was also in a space that Cynthia and I have in Colorado. When we built as we had money to build, we built our house, I built my studio, we built an office for Cynthia and a gallery of sorts. It wasn't meant as a commercial gallery, but we had work on exhibit. Well, it's kind of like some clients are kind of mesmerized, perhaps as I am, of artists making a living. So they want to come up and see how you do this stuff. And we have people coming through. Well, a man came through. You know, we don't quiz people on what their history is, but he saw that piece. It's a human figure here. I always work with anatomy first, and then I put a tire on it, whatever it is. This is a fallen soldier. That soldier is wrapped in a tarpaulin. It was my idea of a veterans memorial. I was going to compete for the New York City Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I missed the deadline, unfortunately, and I still wanted to do the piece, so I did it. That person came through, saw the piece about 6 months later, called us up and said, I really would like to do something with that. I'd like to have you enlarge it. So again, it's the influence of somebody coming through, seeing it, and it's my influence of art imitates life. And you know, back then, this was a pretty dramatic and a pretty expressive piece of sculpture. The end results was this, which that piece was then enlarged. It's one of the few that I've done life-size, but once again, I'm up here on this tall plinth. I really like that kind of exposure of the subject to the environment. And that plinth is about 10 feet high. The figure is life-size. The client who commissioned me to do that, and I do editions of 3 when I do monuments. That man flew over, I think he flew the max, 50 missions in Vietnam, was a Marine captain pilot. And it meant a great deal to him to see a sense of reality. And that's what I am too. I'm a romantic, but I'm a realist. We've seen a lot of memorials. Cynthia and I have traveled all over Europe, and it's just enough to see eagles carrying off soldiers. I want people to understand the tragedy of war. I want them to understand the tremendous sacrifice of war. Nobody goes through a military experience without changing. And this is the ultimate. So it's the kind of thing that I always like expressing. That gives you a size and a scale, and I can show you, there's one, the piece you just saw is in Denver. It's the only piece I have there. This is Riverside National Cemetery. It's kind of the central point of entering the cemetery. And for those of you who may not know that, Arlington has a capacity of 250,000 people. Riverside National Cemetery is going to be one of the largest, with 1.5 million people interred in that cemetery. They have as many as 70 burials a day. And it's just, all the numbers are overwhelming. Certainly many of the veterans that are there and their wives are natural causes, but there are other reasons, and there are other victims of war that are there. So it's something that is dedicated to their sacrifice and their service. The third one, by the way, is in Quantico, Virginia, at the Marine Training Base, and it's just been placed there. We haven't seen it yet, but we've heard that it's in a very nice location. This is back to sports. I actually stopped doing sports art in 2000, so about 15 years ago. I haven't done any other sports figures, but I'm kind of regressing now, showing you what I did in all those years before, literally 30 years of doing sports themes. It's the finish. I liked the competition, I liked the drama, and I did like the gesture and this whole kind of composition with the both figures in that sense of competition. Cynthia sent out a flyer, and periodically does this to all of our clients. Even though I'm not doing sports themes, this was included in a flyer about 3.5 years ago. We showed, and again, now I kind of get into economics. How do you make a living? What do you do to make a living as a professional sculptor? I'm not independently wealthy. We had to make a living. We realized early on that galleries were maybe not going to be the answer. And in some cases, we were forced out because the galleries were either showing avant-garde in the West or they were showing Western art. I'm doing sports themes. So what I ended up, and Cynthia and I kind of formulated, is we have to go to the area of interest. We do not have, it does not do us any good to show to hundreds or thousands of people if they can't afford it. I know that's somewhat selfish perhaps, but in this case we have to make a living. We decided to go to areas where they can afford it and areas where there's interest. So sports clubs, athletic clubs. We showed at Super Bowls, we showed at All-Star games in baseball, and on and on. Those areas that people were interested in and generally speaking had the money to afford the bronze I was producing, because these are expensive. I mean, generally speaking, a bronze of this scale is anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000. The DAC the monies for this project was only provided for by members. It was not taxpayers or any of that sort. But anyway, this piece was one of those chosen, and this is the results of what we're doing now. And you know, we were talking about scanning and all of these other things that are now used today. The last piece I pointed up traditionally was in 2000, and it was a war dog memorial. That piece took me over a year to do. I probably used 300 pounds of clay. I did 5 monumental figures in 3 years, and that was done through scanning, through milling, through all of the technical achievements that we have today that allow especially the sculpture to work in a larger medium. The reason for going to this scale, however, I don't think there's an artist alive who wouldn't want to change something in work they've already created. So what I'm doing here is I've had this piece scanned, we've enlarged it. I'm working with a young fellow, Pat Kennedy, who is a fine artist in his own right. And what I'm doing is we're working on the gesture, and I'm making corrections in the foam. This is real high density foam that was milled, and we have changed the gestures. It's a little difficult perhaps to see it, but there were a lot of change, probably more so on this piece than any of the others. And we did half-life size. Once that was finished, we rescanned it and blew it up so that all the corrections then were done, and we went from half-life size to 1.5 life size. And a little bit of fire and brimstone here. I should have perhaps included a few more photographs of the foundry. Bronze is usually poured at about 2,000, 2,100 degrees into hot molds, which are usually about 1,700 or 1,800 degrees. And then I just recently heard of some guys who were doing just the opposite. Their molds were 2,100 degrees and the bronze was much cooler. But whatever the process, we were using this particular foundry, which is in Berkeley, California. And they are, I think, going to be one of the cutting edge foundries in the United States. We are probably, the next project we do will be printing the waxes. We won't be pouring the waxes, we'll be printing them. And boy, is there an advantage to that. But I think in the next decade or so, we'll be printing in bronze. The lost wax process, it goes back to the Bronze Age. Boom, we're going to change the whole thing in the 21st century. So, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely amazing to me to see what's happening. I am a dinosaur, but I still get a little tactile quality here. And I'm going to do some plaques. And on those plaques, it'll say, this was made by human hands.
Is there a great economic advantage to the new technology?
No, not really. It's very expensive. It's very expensive to scan, and we use ScanSite, which does all the stuff at the Met. They've got all their equipment there. You go into the bookstore, you'll see all those little castings and et cetera, et cetera. It's all scanned by those people and then produced in other places. Tony?
Do you burn out the foam, or do you
Yeah, it's actually not going to be wax. Like we use wax, which, you know, they heat it up and it melts out and evaporates and et cetera. They're using another material that's actually made out of a corn product, but it definitely burns out. There's no transition. It's not quite like styrofoam, which a lot of people are doing, and some people are even making models of little models, you know, like plastic, and they burn that out. But this material, if you can think about it, printing, when you pour wax, and I know this is a little technical, but it just shows you how difficult it is. When you pour wax, if you're pouring like a hand and you have this crack between the two fingers, that edge is in wax. It's very thin because you can't get the wax to stick on the inside. And by the way, if you've ever made candles, the only difference is we pour the wax out. We don't leave it solid and stick a wick in it. But that's very, very thin. So what happens is this is hot, that's hot, but that little place right there, the bronze, is literally sucked out of it and moves in other areas. So you can have a lot of mispouring. Printing, they can make that space. If they say, we want these waxes or we want these images 1/8 of an inch thick everywhere, you just program it in, everything comes out absolutely perfect. And that is going to make a very big difference in casting bronze. And they're doing it, they're printing them now. They're not printing realism, they're making more geometric shapes. A really fine artist by the name of Bruce Beasley in Oakland is doing that with his geometric pieces. And boy, I mean, you can see the sky's the limit, and you can see he knows it. So anyway, foundries, very important. The foundry in Colorado, by the way, is very good, but not quite as cutting edge as it is in Berkeley. But I use both of them periodically. Part 2. Okay, what we're doing here is we're working with that half-life size model. I decided to cast them, make molds and cast them. That gave us an opportunity to work a little on pedestals, but it also gave us a big opportunity to work on patinas, the color that we wanted to use. But the guys here, we're now working on gestures, making sure that the placement of the legs are right. We're working on that gesture, and that little weld line right there is where the legs were connected to the body. And you can imagine, without altering the anatomy, you can do a lot with the figure. And then end results, this happens to be the piece that's at the Detroit Athletic Club, and the patina is, it's basically a light blue patina, especially in the concave areas. We did that whole process again. There was a foam armature here. What's happening now is Ken is working on the 1.5 life-size piece, and my work is expensive mainly because it has very smooth surfaces. And in order to do that, you have to work the metal a lot, you have to do a lot of chasing, and the patina sometimes is not as receptive as it would be if I have a lot of texture. This was another piece of sculpture that I had in that collection. The start, male swimmer, a lot of drama, a lot of amazing gesture. The athletes simply have stimulated me. You know, it's art imitates life. But he is really more of a physical, a very muscular type of swimmer. The downside is the DAC wanted a woman because they had a great Olympic swimmer that trained in their swimming pool. I believe it was back in the 50s. And so they wanted to honor her, or at least the fact that women athletes.
Tom, will you still have that up? When you pointed that up, was there a big problem with weight because it's so far out?
Oh yeah, yeah. Lots of difficulty, which was corrected. We had a very good engineer that worked on the substructure. I mean, it's like we all know the substructure of the Statue of Liberty. In this particular case, that gesture, we had to have lots of stainless steel in there, and we had 2.5-inch rods coming out of both legs.
It was Eiffel who did the Statue of Liberty substructure.
Eiffel did the substructure, and I forgot to ask the class before everybody left, but who knows who sculpted the Statue of Liberty? Bertholdi, right. And where did Bertholdi live? Colmar, France. And Colmar, France is in eastern France. And I didn't mention the influence of the artists that worked there when I went to Europe, but I really like the artists from that eastern region, especially Franciscus Rude. And he did the Departure of the Volunteers, which is the right-hand panel of the Arc de Triomphe. It truly is a masterpiece. I loved his work, and in Dijon, they have a museum filled with his plasters. There's also some other important people there, especially Klaus Sluter. I mean, I know these are not exactly world-class names, but Sluter did just a magnificent memorial with these little mourners lining the coffin, but the sarcophagus. But anyway, I really liked the work that was coming out of that area, and it was not expressionistic or textured. They were earlier pre-Rodin sculptors, and those are the people that influenced my work. So anyway, we got this piece, and I had to convert it, so it took me more time to do this one piece. There we go. Than it did the other 4 figures altogether. This is one of the 3 models I hired. I'm working here strictly with anatomy. I worked with the gesture later, but at least she could pose for me, and I could begin the process of enlarging. I went to the half-life size. This is another foam armature that I used, and now what I'm doing is I'm trying to emphasize, instead of that brute force, I'm trying to emphasize that beauty, the beautiful contours of the figure, and in the end results was this. Her head is much higher up, so she's not that massive power that I had in the male swimmer. Half-life size. From there, I scanned this. We had this piece scanned, and then we started to work and produce the larger piece. I've got quite a few more photos, but what I'm doing here is a little bit of metal work. I normally don't do much of that, but in this case, I was working on it. What we're doing now, we've got the piece now. It's still roughed in. They're doing still a lot of weld work, but what Carl was talking about, we have all this stainless steel coming out of here. We needed to have a substructure that I could use when I got to Detroit. We wouldn't have to sit there and try to figure out how is this piece going and in what angle, et cetera, et cetera. We made this steel frame, and its female receptacle is welded right here, and what I'm doing there is we're going a little further, up, down, etc., and then the guys are tacking it, welding it all up. That piece was completely welded up structurally, and this was sent along with the sculpture, so that when we got to Detroit, we would be able to do this patina. This patina. But anyway, I'm working on, I'll show you what we were able to do with that frame. The patina I used on all of the pieces was really a cupric nitrate with a sulfur base. And what is patina? It's kind of, for me, it's the acceleration of what the color will look like in the environment. Detroit has a much different environment than, for example, here in New Jersey, unless you're right down on the coast. But even there, they don't have the salt air, but they have a lot of other things in the air. But it's an acceleration, and that patina will change. It will grow in that environment. Even though we'll do some maintenance every year, it's going to change, but at least we've accelerated a little bit and gave it that, that coloration. This is the baseball piece, 643, that is included in the group, and the gesture, of course. All of those things I liked and really had fun emphasizing when I was doing sports. There's Carl is adding more of the cupric nitrate to the base, and you can see that it's added hot. And this is the running back. It's kind of ironic that when I did this sculpture, it was the last athletic piece that I did 15 years ago. I love the way Barry Sanders ran through the line, and that kind of his rather unorthodox way of holding the ball, et cetera, et cetera. This is 15 years ago, long before the DAC commissioned me, but I did put a number 20 on the jersey, which was Barry Sanders. So it was kind of like, did you do Barry Sanders? And I said, no, but I liked the way he ran. The little more detail, working on the head. I can show you now all of the frames, and then we'll get to that pedestal. This is what we did with the other three sculptures. Again, we have determined the gesture. So now it's simply a matter of getting that placed in the environment and maintaining the same position. What we're doing here, this was the frame that you saw in this previous photograph of the runners. There's the receptacle for the tall male, the shorter male on this side, completely encased in rebar, and this will then be poured. We're sighting the line for the other sculpture. Kind of things I never thought I'd have to do as a sculptor, but it's fun following the process. The pedestals are made out of what's called a continuous pour, or a, remember the name? It's a consolidated concrete, which has a little different mixture. And we also spent a lot of time in the forms. There's no pop ties, there's no seams whatsoever. I wanted that to look like a block of limestone, a block of stone, or just a block, whatever it was, but no distractions with all the other stuff. I do like Louis Kahn's work, though, by the way, where he left the pop ties in his concrete on the architectural buildings that he did. The great one was the Salk Institute in San Diego, but anyway, above and beyond that, this is the pedestal now that's been formed. The tall runner is being lifted over. The female runner is going to be placed in that position, and we have end results. These nice solid monoliths with the figures not being detracted by anything in the pedestal. Running back, 643. Anybody know what 643 means?
Shortstop, right?
Tried to emphasize a triple play, but if each guy at the number was out. But anyway, the three pieces as they appear. This is an island in front of the club right here, and the fourth and final piece, the swimmer, was placed outside one of their entrances. They used a granite detail to kind of imply water, of course, and some of the other photos. We've got a few night scenes, the lighting, and sculpture requires lighting of any kind, whether it's natural or whether it's spots, whatever the case may be, and they're still working on the lighting. And by the way, in terms of lighting, they spent 2 years trying to figure out how to light the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And it was a very, very long process until they ended up with what they have now. But You can see some of these pieces are not quite as washed out, or at least exposed to light as like the others, so they're still kind of a work in progress. That was kind of an interesting shot. One of the members sent us that. That's an early morning shot. A lot of guys, a lot of women go to the club to work out very early, and when he got there, he saw that and took a photo for us. I love drawing. Drawing is the language of art. I did include one for the group, the class this morning. When I was teaching here and teaching life drawing, it was so important for us to do 5 and 10 second gesture drawings in ink or Conte or what have you. It really is a spontaneous type of response. But what I've done now is I've kind of regressed back. I've been influenced by a lot of other things. A good friend of ours in Taos, New Mexico, David LaFell, fabulous painter. And he, of course, his hero is Rembrandt. So over the years, talking and meeting David in his studio, it was just kind of the thing. I wanted to try to do some self-portraits. So instead of doing a 5 and 10 second gesture, I've kind of done these, and it's a very small drawing. I've done these, and this one probably was 6 months and maybe 150 hours, as opposed to a 6 or a 10 second gesture. But self-portraits kind of describe things, and I would just carry this thing around, and you've got a model around, so you can do that. But I enjoyed that type of description, and telling maybe a little bit more about myself. The piece also appears, I think I brought it along, but we used it on one of our flyers that, and of course this is a derivation because we extended the blackout, but it was a lot of fun just kind of carrying it around. I guess Leonardo carried around the Mona Lisa for what, decades, and would paint on it a little bit here and there, and on and on. This is our bittersweet photo. This piece was in Cherry Hills. I did editions of 3 in Monuments, and in this case, I did the winning, not the winning, losing, I did the first and the contemporary. This is Athletes of Race, primitive, no tack. I mean, what was the first race or the first equestrian figure? So in that case, that's what's occurring here. It's the same figure, same horse down here that's tacked up. But it's kind of interesting that primitive is right there because I did editions of 3, but one of them ended up in this box. The piece was knocked over by 4 guys who were on a construction crew. They cut it up into little pieces like that and took it to a scrap yard and got $5,000 for the scrap. So the people that owned the sculpture immediately put out a $50,000 reward for any information, and of course their buddies who didn't do anything got $50,000 for blowing the whistle on it, and those guys got some jail time. But it happens. Bronze is a semi-precious material. Sure, it's one of my children has been lost, but you know, it happens, and when it happened, immediately, I remember when Cynthia told me about it, my first reaction was, my God, think of what we lost in Mexico and in South America. All the beautiful gold work that was done now ended up in ingots and in Spain and Portugal. So I can't feel terribly bad about it.
Read somewhere that some ancient, like Greek marbles and stuff were burned to make lines.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And what did, I mean, it happens throughout history, what they wrapped fish in box, you know, cantatas and on and on. So it just happens. But, you know, if this is what you do, this is what you're exposed to. It doesn't make much.
I think maybe life was giving you a little reminder.
Is indeed, you know. Well, how much will be left someday? Who knows? But I know one thing, the most important thing for me is to go into the studio and work. And these things are the end results, and I know it's sad, but it does happen, and it will happen again, I'm sure. Although most of the metal suppliers now are pretty much aware that If you see things that look like artwork, right away it's a stop. You talk about something else. Eugene Fodor was a world-class violinist, owned a Stradivarius. It was stolen and ended up in a pawn shop for 10 bucks. The pawn ticket was 10 bucks. Fortunately, the pawn shop obviously held it, notified the police, notified Eugene Fodor, and he got the violin back. But it happens, so what, it just happens. This photograph shows back to Riverside National, this large cemetery, military cemetery. This area right here, right in the center, is going to be dredged out. It's going to be made for a sculpture placement, and what they are interested in having is a sculpture, and it's one of the rare commissions. We have everything to do this project except the money, and that's kind of not such a small thing, but anyway, Cynthia's working very hard to come up with the monies. It's going to be produced for Riverside. It is an Indian statue commemorating 200 years of service to the U.S. military by the American Indians, the Native Americans. And I decided to go to that influence of Balzac, like I was telling Carl. I love that geometric shape that Rodin created when he did that sculpture. I loved Robert Indiana and Klaus Oldenburg, all of those, Rauschenberg, people that used symbols to represent certain events. Well, in this case, I used a continental flag, and look what you get to do with all these neat lines, and I wrapped the 13 stars around his shoulder and started with that particular gesture. We did change one other thing, and this is now my clayed up half-life size image, and I've used a tire, generally speaking, but the hands, remember the hand photo? I try to emulate that as close as possible, and I like hand gestures. I think they're extremely expressive, as you'll see. This is actually a 1.5. I wanted to experiment with the head, a quintessential medicine man, leader, older tribal leader, and we ended up with, this is that little element that I added to it, the Jefferson medal. Rather than the rattle, I want it to be even more 200 years. The first military, really important military expedition was Lewis and Clark. We had a chance some years ago before he died to meet Stephen Ambrose. And we talked about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I came from Sioux City, Iowa. The only fatality in that event was Sergeant Floyd. Little grammar school kids, we all went to the Floyd Monument. We all understood that Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri and on and on. But the Lewis and Clark group carried these medals with them. Jefferson said, give them to the tribal leaders and welcome them into the United States from the Louisiana Purchase. Well, a lot of those tribes, as they went west, the word preceded them. And they were saying, why are we being invited into this place? Because we've already got our own nation. So there was certainly some doubts, some uncertainties. And it's really interesting, the story goes that then they started, the tribes further west started not to wear them. And then supposedly some of them actually gave them to their enemies. You have the bad karma, we'll stay safe in our own nation. Anyway, that's the Jefferson medal, and that's what he is holding. So we have the 200 years, we have the contribution, we have the bittersweet. It's like everything that the American Indians have done, included what they provided for this country, can never be replaced. But at least it's a full story about that event. These are photos of the end result, half life size, and what I was able to do with the flag, those geometric lines, and now the Jefferson medal. The piece is earmarked for that space in the cemetery that I showed you. It's supposed to be 2 times life size. That'll be the biggest size or scale I've ever worked in. And it will stand probably on a rather tall pedestal. So from the other side of that little lake, 2 times life size, and then maybe on a 12-foot pedestal, it should be a pretty strong image that people will be able to see and drive by when they're at the cemetery. I'm working in Berkeley. I'm doing some of the experimenting on coloration and patina, and a lot of it's going to be pigment. White is very difficult to maintain, especially outside, so we'll probably have to add some pigment to it. Normally it's bismuth nitrate and a number of other white responsive chemicals, but that will be a piece that I'm looking forward to the enlargement. It should be a real exciting project. This is what I did after I stopped doing sports themes 15 years ago. I wanted to do figures in columns. I wanted to do figures in architecture. And I wanted to do non-didactic kinds of pieces, not storytelling, I wanted now just to talk about one solo event or emotion. In this particular case, these figures all represent that element of emotion. And I can show you some details, except for this piece. That's an Armenian memorial, and it represents the Holocaust that occurred in 1915. Cynthia is part Armenian. These are the caryatids. They're figures in toil. That's it. Just figures that are in toil, holding up those columns. And the word caryatid is a word that describes figures used as columns. In this case, I went perhaps a little bit further. These are the Ionians. They're figures in birth. They're figures that are emerging from the column. She's emerging out of it. He's feeling the heartbeat. That's it. It's just birth. It's not, a football player running to the line in a certain type of attire. The nude figure, by the way, for me is a sense of vulnerability. And so where am I going with all of this? I'm going to go to a piece. This is Cynthia's office, by the way. I'm going to a piece right here. It's titled The Door of Sorrows. I resisted quite a bit, and when 9/11 happened, I worked here. You've probably been affected more than a lot of areas in the United States by that tragedy. You're so close. I remember when Cynthia and I were at the at Grand Central Station, just weeks, maybe I think it was like 2 weeks after the event. There were all these boards that had photos on them that people could post. Have you seen my loved one? I mean, it went down, back, and both directions. And you know how big Grand Central is. Literally thousands, of course, of messages. A lot of the things that were printed there stimulated me to do something else. And after 3.5 years, I did Door of Sorrows. And I thought, well, that's it. That kind of describes what I'm going to, how I feel about that tragedy and that event. She is meant to be kinetic in a bit of a sense. She's modeled on both sides of the door, so when you open the door, she's kind of like in a movement stage, but she is embracing herself, she's holding herself, and my thought was to go through that door then into a series of columns. I've done 12 ideas, I've done 12 gestures, and I've finished 5 of them. And now I've been working on it for about 7-8 years. So I work very slowly, but I have been obviously working on the Detroit project and many others. I'll try to show you some of the pieces more clearly. I'm working on the first one. Each column represents one solo thing, an event, an emotion. And the first column was a column this one is a little bit later. The first column I did was discovery. I love using hand gestures. I love the expression you can achieve from those types of gestures. These are details of this column. These 2 figures are in discovery. There were people on the planes. There were people that realized before it happened that it was going to happen. And I wanted to stop that. I wanted to show that emotion. And it's like the boxing memorial. I don't want people just to forget about it. I love the memorial that's at the Trade Center, Footprint. It really is very expressive. I love one other one just as much, which is Fountain of Tears, which is across the street. It's a wonderful kinetic piece. If you haven't seen it, there is a pond or a basin of water that is in a large, tall atrium, and there are photographs of the 17 people, and I think it was UPS, wasn't it, or FedEx employees, one of the two, that were lost in the Trade Center tragedy. So their photos are engraved on pieces, on images around that water feature. And then all of a sudden, if you're reading it, you look at the figure, you'll see a ring created by, obviously, a raindrop. Water comes out of the ceiling at a drop at a time, all the way down. It's got to be 30 feet, and hits that water. Fountain or water of tears. I mean, talk about emotion. What a fabulous idea. I have to go further. I want people involved. I want to express the feelings that I have about that event, and the nude figure is the most vulnerable figure you can have. So I wanted to do all of these, not clothed, but nude, and that represents that period of discovery. And there's both anger, there's both fear, and so all of the emotions I've tried to express in the piece. And these are quarter life size, and that shows you kind of how they're going to be illustrated. You may not see this very well, but this is round. I've changed this to a square column and a square column, and yeah, it kind of places them in an environment that maybe is indicative of being on the top floors. It doesn't make any difference. I had work in the World Trade Center. I had work in Cantor Fitzgerald. They lost 700 people. And you know, I'm just thinking, a bronze was lost, a horse was lost, life is lost, and there's nothing that compare with anything like that. So again, I wanted to, no more plaques, maybe no more falling water, but I really wanted to give some sort of additional emotion to it. I'm working on the next piece in order, not always, but in this case it's in order. These two figures are in resignation, and they're resigned to their fate. And there certainly were people who were making those last phone calls, but you can see that, you know, the scale I'm working in, and those two figures. And I like to kind of focus again on these hands. You can see they're embracing themselves and the detail on the hand. And then this happens to be one of the last pieces I've worked on. It's titled Flight, and I think that title perhaps expresses it. There are 3 figures in this column. Some of them have 2, as you just saw. One of them you'll see has 1. But anyway, I'm working on those 3 figures. It has been finished, as this is pretty close to finish. And this is the last piece that I've worked on, and it's the last piece in that collection of 12. It's a pregnant female, single figure. She represents rebirth. She represents a continuation of life. It's not over. Over 40 children were born to fathers who died on 9/11, and I wanted to at least realize this isn't just a final end to the process. It's rebirth, and its life is going to continue on. Fini. That's it. Thank you very much.